Thank you everyone for tuning in for this presentation on future-proofing your device changes, key insights from the 2024 PCCP guidance. This Lunch and Learn is to discuss the introductions of PCCPs from the 2022 Food and Drug Omnibus Reform Act, as well as the 2024 draft guidance released titled Predetermined Change Control Plans for Medical Devices. And these updates reflect the FDA's current thinking for a streamlined process for managing changes to medical devices. Predetermined change control plans are a regulatory framework that allow medical device manufacturers to plan and manage certain changes to their devices in advance, rather than seeking individual FDA approvals for each modification. A PCCP is essentially the documentation describing what modifications will be made to a device and how those modifications will be assessed. FDA reviews your PCCP as part of a marketing submission, whether that be a 510K or a PMA, for a device to ensure the continued safety and effectiveness of the device without necessitating additional marketing submissions for each modification. Some key points from the 2022 Act was establishing the framework for the plans, as well as increased regulatory flexibility. Initially, the concept was developed with artificial intelligence and machine learning updates specifically in mind. FDORA mandated the development and implementation of a framework for Predetermined Change Control Plans, PCCPs, formalizing the concept and guiding how manufacturers can use these plans to manage changes to their medical devices. The Act highlighted the need for greater regulatory flexibility in managing device changes and supported the use of PCCPs to streamline the approval process. Before PCCPs, any minor change that could not be covered in a letter to file necessitated a new 510K, and this allows manufacturers to implement changes without needing separate FDA approvals for each modification. There was a significant impact on the regulatory landscape from PCCPs. It streamlined approvals to reduce the burden by allowing for pre-approved changes, which can expedite the process for updating medical devices. It called for enhanced guidance, ensuring that manufacturers have a clear understanding of how to develop and implement these changes, and a key reason for the 2024 updates that came as well. There was an increased focus on safety. Despite the increased flexibility, the emphasis on maintaining device safety and effectiveness remains a critical aspect of the PCC framework. FDORA's focus on PCCPs reflects a broader effort to modernize regulatory processes and make them more adaptable to the evolving landscape of medical device innovation. In 2024, there came an update to PCCPs under the draft FDA guidance, Predetermined Change Control Plans for Medical Devices. These changes aim to provide clearer guidance, enhance safety, and better align with evolving industry practices and regulatory needs. The updates reflect FDA's commitment to ensuring that the process for managing changes to medical devices remain robust and effective. Importantly, a hallmark of the initial act and the 2024 guidance emphasize that the changes cannot negatively impact the safety or effectiveness of the device. So you really have to assess if a change adversely affects safety and effectiveness before developing a PCCP. The 2024 updates include expanding the scope of permissible changes under a PCCP, enhanced risk assessment requirements, more detail on documentation and reporting to the FDA, harmonization with other regulatory requirements, and a call for periodic review and updates to a company's PCCP. In general, any major change is not applicable under a PCCP. You can't use a PCCP for a change that may adversely impact safety and effectiveness. You're going to hear me say that over and over. It's a huge part of the framework. You should always assess for a change in safety and effectiveness before proceeding with a PCCP, but these are some areas where you might potentially utilize one. So design or manufacturing changes, such as modifications to a device component, software updates like algorithm improvements, labeling changes to promotional materials or user manuals, and quality control changes like updates to quality assurance procedures or testing methods. Again, none of these are major changes, but they are changes that might have necessitated a full-on 510K previously. I'm going to discuss some of the recommended content that you should include in your predetermined change control plan when developing a 510K. There's 4 main components that you want to ensure are included in your plan, which is a description of the modifications, your modification protocol, some sort of traceability between the description of modifications and your modification protocols, and an impact assessment of the change. In the description of modifications section, you want to describe specific changes to the device characteristics and performance resulting from the modification. There should be a specific rationale for the change to each part of the device that's planned to be modified. And FDA also recommends that a PCCP include only a limited number of modifications, that those modifications are specific and that they can be verified and validated. Each modification needs to be linked to a specific performance evaluation activity, which is described in your modification protocol, which is where the traceability section comes in. You really want a clear delineation between the modification and how you're evaluating it in the protocol. The modification protocol should include the documentation describing the methods that will be followed when developing, validating, and implementing the modifications. And the protocol must be compliant with the QSR, including that the manufacturer must document the change in accordance with the manufacturer's quality system. The modification protocol should also include the verification and validation activities, including things like the predefined acceptance criteria and step-by-step delineation of how these modifications will be implemented while assuring that the device remains safe and effective. Some content that you want to ensure is in your modification protocol. Of course, your performance evaluation methods. This is your study design, performance metrics, statistical tests, things like that. You also want to make sure somewhere in your modification protocol, you have a clear statement that says if there's an unresolvable failure in a performance evaluation for one of your proposed modifications, for example, your acceptance criteria isn't met, the failure is recorded somewhere and that modification is not being implemented. If you can't meet your acceptance criteria, you can't make the change. You also need to update your procedures when implementing these changes. So you would describe in the modification protocol how these updates will be made consistent with the QSR, and you would provide appropriate transparency to users and update user training as applicable. You also want to describe your post-market surveillance plans and procedures in this section, what kind of real-world monitoring you'd be doing, notification requirements, things like that. Traceability is the biggest section in the PCCP. As I mentioned earlier, you want to clearly define which parts of the modification protocol are applicable to each modification in the description of modification section. I've included an example watered down traceability table that might be found in this section of the PCCP. So you would identify each modification. You might have one, you might have several. In the example that I'll be going through later with you guys, I inputted into this table here. So in this example, you might be updating your algorithm to improve the accuracy of your device. This modification is described in the description of modification section. You would then describe your performance evaluation methods. In this example, we would do some software and performance testing. And then we would describe how we're updating our procedures. So we want to state again that it's consistent with the QSR and following the company's existing procedures. This would also be described in the modification protocol section of the PCCP. Lastly, you want to include an impact assessment, which is a documentation of the assessment that you performed as to the benefits and risks of implementing this change for your device, as well as any mitigations to any risks that might have arose. The manufacturer's existing quality system should be used as the framework for conducting an impact assessment. You want to discuss how the individual modifications included in the PCCP impact not only the particular device function you're talking about, in that previous example, your algorithm, but also the overall functionality of the device, including other software functions or the device hardware itself. You also want to make clear references in the impact assessment to the relevant sections of the marketing submission that support your assessment. A great example would be your risk assessment. So you want to make clear relations between those areas in the 510K or PMA. This is straight from the guidance, what they are expecting to see in your marketing submission for an impact assessment of a PCCP. You would compare the version of the device with each modification implemented to the version of the device without any modifications. You would discuss the benefits and risks as well as any harms. You would discuss your V&V activities and the implementation of one modification impacts the implementation of another, for example, if you have multiple. And lastly, you would describe the cumulative impact of implementing all modifications if you have several. I also wanted to just show you guys what it would look like in a 510K summary. They do expect this to be included in your 510K summary if you have a PCCP in your 510K. You would just high level describe the planned modifications, your V&V activities, and how you intend to communicate these modifications to the user as they're rolled out later on. This is just high level. You could probably go into a little bit more detail, but I kept it pretty high level here. I wanted to run through an example with you guys of a specific device and how you might describe the modifications in a PCCP. So in this example, it's a wearable cardiac monitor designed to continuously track heart rate rhythm and provide real-time alerts for arrhythmias. The intended change, which can only be implemented if it's described in a PCCP as part of an approved 510K, is improved accuracy through algorithm updates. So I wanted to ask you guys, based on something that I have continuously been emphasizing, what would be your first step if you are even thinking about making a change through a PCCP?
Assess the risk.
That's correct, yes. You want to ensure that any changes don't adversely affect the device safety or effectiveness, so you would conduct a risk assessment, gather evidence, things like that. That's absolutely correct. Once we've confirmed that there are no changes to the safety or effectiveness, we want to assess the change category. There's 3 main categories: minor, moderate, and major. A minor might be something that doesn't significantly affect safety or effectiveness. A moderate might impact the performance, but remains within the safety margins of the device. And a major change would be something that could affect safety and effectiveness and require a new submission. Do you guys have any ideas what category this change to the algorithm might fall under?
Do you have a little bit more detail, Jean, on what the algorithm changes are for?
It's improving accuracy, but it's not introducing any new functions.
Moderate?
Yes, thank you, Bob. So if the algorithm enhances the existing functionality without changing any fundamental uses, it would be considered a moderate change. If the algorithm change significantly improved performance metrics or altered clinical outcomes, maybe reducing false positives, that would be considered a major change and not something that we could submit under a PCCP. So you would assess the impact of the proposed changes on your device safety and effectiveness, on your regulatory compliance, making sure that the change is still compliant with any current guidances and regulations, and that there's no major changes to the user experience. You would make sure you already have a risk assessment completed to evaluate the potential risks associated with the change. And then I wanted to pop in this quote from the guidance that specifically calls out that a PCCP change needs to ensure that the device remains safe and effective without the change, and that the device would remain substantially equivalent to the predicate. This is big for us in regulatory. If the change is important enough or impactful enough that you're no longer substantially equivalent to your predicate, it's not the sort of change that you could make under a PCCP. These are just some details on documenting your change. You would want to make sure you maintain detailed records of your rationale, your impact assessment, your implementation plan, any approval processes that the change underwent. You would want to outline the hierarchy of approvals. This would include your design control team, quality assurance, and of course, regulatory affairs. Some post-implementation review that's important under the 2024 guidance. They want to make sure that you're monitoring the change. You would establish metrics to evaluate the performance of the device after the change has occurred. And you also want a feedback loop. You would want to create a process for collecting user feedback to assess the impact of the change out in the real world. Lastly, you want to make sure that you are staying up to date on compliance and auditing. You would regularly review your change control process to ensure adherence to the plan and current regulatory requirements. And you want to conduct periodic audits to assess the effectiveness of the PCCP and make necessary adjustments. So this kind of is an umbrella of what you might do once you have determined that you need a PCCP and the sort of steps that you would follow to both develop your PCCP, implement it, and stay on top of compliance after the change has been implemented. I wanted to show you guys just a specific example from the guidance. They do a really good job of giving you examples, one overarching example, as well as the kinds of changes that might be applicable under a PCCP, as well as ones that are not applicable under a PCCP. In this example from the guidance, the device is a non-absorbable polyethylene surgical suture intended for soft tissue. Some changes that you could do under a PCCP would be changing to a non-novel sterilization method, extending your shelf life, additional sutures to the product line, or maybe a change in dye under the appropriate FDA listed color additives. Some examples that would not be appropriate for a PCCP would be changing the intended use by adding antimicrobials, for example, a change in design that is novel or atypical, or adding agents that are not included under the FDA's approved additives, things like that. And on that note, I'll just end on kind of an overarching idea of when not to use a PCCP. As I've said before, any major design changes you would not cover under a PCCP. This would require a new 510K. Any critical safety issues, these are changes that are in response to adverse events that require immediate action or recall rather than a controlled change process. If there's significant user experience modifications that would dramatically change how the user interacts with the device, that would require a new 510K. New indications for use, changes requiring new clinical trials, or significant manufacturing process changes would all require a new PCCP.